and welcome to the studio. Today we are going to look at mixing a whole range of oranges, specifically for flower painting and botanical art. We are going to start with a little bit of color mixing theory, looking at the bias color wheel to get a better understanding at what type of orange we can use, what type of yellows and what type of red we can use to make sure that we get the type of orange that we want. And then we're going to look at some color mixing exercises that I did with my Patreon subscribers with 108 different variations you can have from the colors that I have selected for the mixes. We're back in the studio, and the first thing I'm going to do is show you where the colors are on the color wheel that I'm going to use to make the orange mixes. It is done on the principle of bias color mixing. So you have to forget about cool and warm colors. This system is now mainly obsolete and quite confusing. The bias system is by far a lot easier to understand, and it makes a lot more sense. The idea behind it is that there is no such thing as a single primary color. Because, for example, if you take yellow, which goes from this segment to this one, any yellow you pick will either be green bias, that means that it will lean towards green, or orange bias, meaning that it will lean towards orange. There is no such thing as a pure mid-yellow. The main green bias yellow is lemon yellow. In my case, I use Hansa Yellow Light. And the best pigment for that green bias yellow is PY3. And the main orange bias yellows, I use Hansa Yellow Deep. Most people have either New Gamboge or Indian Yellow in their palette, and they're all this sort of orange bias yellow. The one I use is Hansa Yellow Deep, which is PY65. Now, in between those two, I have other yellows that I use, but as long as you have one of each, one green bias and one orange bias, you can mix all the secondary colors that you will need. Today we are concentrating on orange, so I have two orange in my palette. One is Daniel Smith Permanent Orange. It is a yellow biased orange, and the pigment is PO62. And my other one is Pyrrole Orange, and that's a red bias orange. And the pigment for that is PO73. And really, PO62 and PO73 are the two main pigments used by most manufacturers for your yellow biased orange and your red biased orange. Now, on the other side of the orange, we have all the reds. And on my palette, because I'm a flower painter, I also have some pinks and magentas. So I'm starting here with an orange bias red, which is Pyrrole Scarlet, PR255 for the pigment. Then going into the mid-reds, and then going towards the violet bias reds with carmine, and then towards the pinks, and then the magentas until I reach the violet colors. So today for orange, we are going to concentrate on the section that starts at Hansa Yellow Light, the green bias yellow, and goes to carmine, which includes yellow and red as primaries and orange as the secondary. Now let's look at the exact palette we are going to use. There are two ways we can go about mixing our orange colors. The first one is starting with an orange base, for example here, Permanent Orange, and then modifying it with different colors. For example here, Hansa Yellow Light. And on the other side, Pyrrole Scarlet. Or the other way is to start completely from scratch, for example with Hansa Yellow Deep plus Pyrrole Scarlet, making an orange. It is very important to realize that whichever way you're going to use, whether you start with a base color close to your local color and modifying it with other colors, or whether you start from scratch to make that secondary color, either way, you're going to need to do some color mixing. The chances of looking at a subject and looking at your little swatch of color in your color book and for it to be an exact match, that's practically impossible. It's never going to happen. And even if it does, when you look at a flower and you look at the petals, it is never a flat color. The color I'm going to paint after doing these mixing exercises is a tulip. And if I look at the petal on that tulip, there's about a dozen different oranges I can see in there. So just picking one color and using it flat is never going to cut it. And which one you choose is entirely up to you. There's no right or wrong in this. Whichever you find more comfortable, just go for it. Now let's go back for the color wheel for a minute and have my orange as the center. And look at what other colors I have on the side of it. On the yellow side, I've got Hansa Yellow Deep and Hansa Yellow Light, which are the two yellows in my palette, the two main yellows, the orange bias and the green bias. And on the other side of orange, I've got Scarlet Lake, which is my orange bias red, and Carmine, which is violet bias red. This is a simplified version of the color wheel that I've just showed you. And instead of having loads of yellows and loads of red, I have cut down to what you would have with a very reduced palette. So the minimum amount of colors that you can have in your palette. And that minimum is 2 of each primary. So I have reduced the big color wheel I showed you earlier to that simplified version of 2 of each primary. So I've got a green biased yellow, an orange biased yellow, an orange biased red, and a violet biased red. If you mix your secondary color, your orange, using your primaries, this is how it goes. If you choose the 2 primaries that are directly on either side of your secondary color, so here with the orange, you have your orange biased yellow and your orange biased red. If you mix those 2, you are going to get a very saturated orange. Now, if you move away from the orange bias colors, say you're keeping an orange bias yellow, but you're moving away from orange biased with the red, you're going to have a more muted color. Equally, if you stay orange bias with the red, but you move away from that red to a green bias yellow, you're also going to get a muted orange. And if you move away on both sides, so if you ignore completely the 2 orange bias colors and you go to the violet bias red and the green bias yellow, you are going to get an even more muted color. You are going to get this kind of orange. And you can see the difference between the 2. One is a lot more saturated than the other because you use the orange bias colors. These are a couple of exercises that I've done with my Patreon subscribers. If you like my tutorials, it's worth checking out. The subscription starts at £3 a month, and there's dozens of tutorials on there, all without ads, and we're building a really nice little community on there. Back to orange. The exercise was to start with permanent orange, which is my basic orange in the palette, and then modify it with different colors. These are all the yellows in my palettes, and these are a selection of the reds. And then to look at the range of orange that we have. And you can see from this that with the orange bias yellow, you get much more saturated colors than when you use the green biased yellow. This is a lot more muted, this is a lot more saturated, but this is quite a nice, soft, yellow biased orange. Quinacridone yellow makes a very bright mix, because it's a very saturated color. Mayan yellow gives a lot of texture, so it's not a very saturated orange, because Mayan yellow is not exactly orange biased, but it's quite a textured pigment, so you get quite a bit of texture on there. And if you want to do a very smooth flower with delicate petals like a poppy or a tulip, this is going to give you trouble because it's really hard. You can see here, just painting this in the same way I've painted the other ones, it's really hard to get a smooth wash with Mayan yellow. But it has its own advantages. It's very useful for other things. Nickel Azure Yellow is a yellow that looks absolutely yucky in the palette, but when you paint with it, it's that beautiful golden yellow, and I'm very fond of it. And again, not saturated, because it's not a saturated color, it's quite muted. But these oranges are quite golden, and again, it can be very useful. Now with the red, again with the orange bias red Pyrrole Scarlet, you have more saturated colors than with a violet bias red, such as Carmine. So if you do need a very saturated orange, Pyrrole Scarlet is the one to go for to mix with your permanent orange. Pyrrole Red is more or less a mid-red, so it's still quite saturated. Carmine, however, is violet biased, so you're getting into sort of burnt orange there, with a hint of violet in the back, in the undertone, which is actually quite nice as well. Quinacridone Coral, like the name indicates, although other browns usually call it quinacridone red, gives a really nice range of very deep coral oranges and pinks. You know, when you have a rose that's not quite pink, but also not quite orange, but in between the two, Quinacridone Coral with permanent orange, that mix works really well. If it needs to be paler, you can just water it down. Quinacridone Pink, again, a range of coral, but going more towards pink and less towards orange. And Lilac, technically Lilac isn't even a red, Quinacridone Lilac, it's a magenta. But I think the mix of Quinacridone Lilac with permanent orange is very interesting. It almost goes towards a maroon orange red. But again, for some roses, it's a very beautiful mix. And some flowers are just that color, and you look at them and you think, what color is that? And you can't really name it. It's so in between other things. So that's a mix I probably wouldn't use very often, but when it's the one to use, it's definitely the one to use. So you would probably have different colors from the ones I have because you've used your own yellows and reds. But we're gonna go through mine and see what they look like. And at the end, I will add to the video a list of all the paints I have used with their pigment, so you can compare to what you have. Or treat yourself to a new color, who knows. The second exercise we did was to forego the use of a ready-made orange and just mix from two primary colors. And you can see the most saturated colors are happening here, which is Hansa Yellow Deep with mainly the Pyrrole Scarlet and then going to the other colors. And as you move away from the orange bias red, you're getting more and more muted. So if you need something very saturated, you're looking around here, which is Hansa Yellow Deep with Pyrrole Scarlet, and it would be with Pyrrole Red as well. And the most muted ones are Nickel Azure Yellow, because it's not a saturated pigment, mixed with violet bias red, so Carmine, Quinacridone Coral is a bit different. It's a bit off the chart because it is a coral rather than an orange. But Nickel Azure Yellow mixed with Quinacridone Pink, for example, makes a really nice range of burnt orange with a pink undertone. And with Pyrrole Scarlet, it's just pure burnt orange, a proper orange, but not saturated at all. Nickel Azure Yellow and Pyrrole Scarlet make this beautiful golden orange. So hopefully after all this you have a little bit more of an understanding of the bias theory and how to get a saturated orange if you need to, or a more muted orange if you don't need something too saturated. So I would strongly encourage you to look at the yellows in your palette and your reds and do that sort of grid of color swatches, mixing the yellows with each red in turn. And also if you do use one ready-made orange, to mix it with several colors in your palette to see the range you can get. The other orange I mentioned was Pyrrole Orange, but I haven't done the grid with Pyrrole Orange because I mainly use permanent orange, so I mainly use PO62 rather than PO73. I do use sometimes the red bias orange, the Pyrrole Orange, when the subject is extremely close to that color. Otherwise, permanent orange is my base. And for the tulip we're about to paint as a project on Patreon, Tulipa Ballerina, I am going to use permanent orange as a base. That's it from me today. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please use the comments if you have some favorite orange mixes you want to share with us. And I will see you soon in Atelier Sandrine Maugy. Happy painting. Bye.